Welcome back to the Book Nook.
Great to be back.
We had a request from the learner to tackle applied economics, Thinking Beyond Stage 1 by Thomas Sowell.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah, and it seems right up their alley. Always trying to figure out how the world works, looking for those core principles, and wanting to really get to the heart of these complex issues, but, without feeling overwhelmed.
Right.
That makes sense. So that's our mission today, to extract those golden nuggets from Sowell, those actionable insights that we can apply to our thinking and even our decision making.
I like it.
So we'll explore how looking past those immediate consequences, thinking beyond that first step, can lead to some really surprising and effective approaches. And we're talking everything from personal choices to those big, thorny societal problems.
Sounds good. Let's dive in.
All right, let's do it. So what really struck me in Sowell's book is this emphasis on looking beyond what he calls stage 1, considering those ripple effects, those unintended consequences. He argues that so much of our political discourse and decision-making, honestly, gets stuck at that initial level, focusing on the immediate, hoped-for results.
Yeah, that's a big one. He really zeroes in on that difference between what he calls one-stage thinking and a more holistic approach. One that actually examines those subsequent effects, the ones that aren't so obvious right away.
Right.
And as he points out, political discussions, they often just stay at that surface level, concentrating on those intended outcomes, the ones they advertise, even if reality turns out a bit different.
I see. So it's kind of like someone says, hey, let's make all public transportation completely free. And that initial thought, that stage 1, stops at this image of like happy commuters saving money.
Precisely.
No more fare, no more hassle.
It has that immediate appeal, right? It's emotionally engaging, it's easy to grasp, and you can see how politicians could gain a lot of support by championing these seemingly free services, these heavily subsidized benefits.
Right, like free healthcare or free college.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that one-stage thinking, it locks in on that direct benefit to the person who appears to be receiving it.
But then Sowell comes in with that crucial question, and then what? That's where the multi-stage thinking kicks in, right? Like, if public transport is free, who's actually footing the bill for maintenance, for new buses and trains, for the salaries of all those drivers and workers?
That's the key. Multi-stage thinking forces us to consider those cascading effects, those hidden costs, those trade-offs.
Okay.
In that scenario of free public transport, the reality is taxpayers are the ones ultimately covering the tab.
They're the ones paying for a service they might not even use, or that they might prioritize differently if they had more control as consumers.
Absolutely. So you have those initial beneficiaries, the riders, but the ones actually carrying the weight are the taxpayers.
So the politician gets the kudos in stage 1 for offering this freebie, but the voters might end up paying through their noses later on, maybe even for something they rarely or never use.
Right.
And it strikes me that often the biggest beneficiaries in stage 1 are the politicians themselves. They rack up all that political capital.
Oh, absolutely. So well sharp on that point. Their incentives are often aligned with those visible, immediate wins, those things that garner public approval.
Even if down the road things go south.
Precisely. That reminds me of a story Sowell tells about his time studying economics at Harvard. He had Professor Arthur Smithies.
Oh, tell me about this.
So Sowell, being a young, eager student, he's passionately arguing for a particular policy in class, focused on all the good he sees coming from it in the short term.
Right.
And Professor Smithies, in his wisdom, just looks at him and asks, and then what? Just that.
Wow.
That simple question. But it made Sowell stop and think about those subsequent consequences, the ones that went beyond his initial enthusiasm. He actually describes it as a turning point in his intellectual journey, steering him towards a more complete, a more economically sound way of analyzing things.
It's like a little mental tool we can all use, right?
Absolutely.
Anytime someone proposes a policy, or even when we're making personal decisions, just ask, and then what? It could save us a lot of trouble down the line.
Couldn't agree more.
So let's take this multi-stage thinking and apply it to something like taxes. Can you walk me through how that plays out, say, with taxes on businesses?
Sure. Let's imagine a scenario where a local government decides, hey, we need more revenue, let's raise taxes on corporations. They're anticipating a quick boost to their coffers, right?
Yeah.
More money for public services.
Makes sense on the surface, right? More taxes, more money for schools, roads, all that good stuff.
That's stage 1 thinking. But now let's step back and ask, and then what? So stage 2. Those higher taxes, they increase the cost of doing business in that area. And what happens? It can start to eat away at the income generated locally, the income that both the corporation and its employees are taxed on. So you might have a higher tax rate, but the actual amount of money you're taxing is shrinking.
So businesses might become more hesitant to expand, maybe slow down hiring, or even hold back on investments.
Exactly. And then comes stage 3. As these companies grow, they have options. They can choose to set up shop or expand their existing operations in places where the tax climate is more favorable.
So they move to a different state, a different country even.
Right, and they might relocate employees who are willing to move, and for those who stay behind, they might hire new people elsewhere. So that initial area, the one with those high taxes, starts losing out on potential growth. They might even see an exodus of their workforce and businesses.
And that leads to...
Stage 4. As more and more companies either pack up and leave or decide not to expand there, the total tax revenue collected under those high rates, it can actually end up being less than what they were bringing in under the old lower rates, simply because there are fewer businesses operating and generating taxable income in that jurisdiction.
So it backfires completely.
Pretty much. And you might even see job losses, and then they have to cut back on those very services they were hoping to fund.
It's a vicious cycle.
It is. And here's the kicker. Those politicians who initiated the whole thing, they might not even be around anymore to face the music.
They've moved on to bigger and better things.
Right, years have passed. They might have climbed the political ladder, gotten elected to higher office. Even if they're still around, it's tough to hold them accountable for those dwindling tax revenues, the job losses, the service reductions. Unless, of course, voters and the media connect the dots back to those initial policies, those stage 1 decisions.
Which requires that multi-stage thinking.
Exactly.
So short-term political gain can turn into long-term economic pain, and it can be really hard to trace that pain back to the source. Now, another area where we see this clash between immediate appeal and long-term consequences is price controls. How does Sowell approach that?
Price controls, they're a classic example of one-stage thinking in action.
Right.
The goal, the one they announce, is to keep prices from going up to protect consumers from what they perceive as price gouging or just generally high costs for essential stuff.
So if the price of gas or rent suddenly shoots up, the idea of the government stepping in and saying, nope, you can't charge that much, sounds pretty good, at least initially.
Right. It's that stage 1 appeal, that immediate feel-good benefit. But when you analyze it economically, you have to look at what comes next. And great example Sowell uses the California electricity crisis back in 2001, 2002.
Oh, yeah, I vaguely remember that. Weren't there rolling blackouts?
Yes, there were. It was a complex situation, for sure. The fundamental cost of producing electricity in California was rising, and for a bunch of reasons. They had reduced rainfall, which meant less hydroelectric power, and the cost of fuels, oil, natural gas, that was all going up too. So it was getting more expensive to generate electricity.
Okay, so the power companies were facing higher costs, and normally they would pass those on to consumers.
In a free market, yeah, those rising costs would be reflected in higher prices, and that would encourage people to conserve energy and producers to, ramp up supply.
But that's not what happened.
No. California politicians stepped in and imposed price controls. They put a cap on how high electricity prices could go. That was their stage 1 move, trying to shield consumers from those immediate price hikes.
And politically, it made them look good, right? Protecting the little guy from those greedy corporations.
Exactly. But then came the next stages, and those were not pretty. Since the utility companies couldn't charge prices that actually covered their expenses, they couldn't pay the wholesalers. And guess what? The wholesalers, they started refusing to supply electricity to those cash-strapped utilities. I mean, why would you sell something if you're not going to get paid a fair price?
That's a recipe for disaster, right? A breakdown of the whole system.
And that's exactly what happened. It got so bad that the governor had to step in, using state funds, taxpayer money, to buy the electricity that the wholesalers weren't selling to the utilities. So in trying to protect consumers, they ended up using taxpayer dollars to prop up the system.
Wow, so they bailed out the system with public funds.
They did. And here's Sowell's point. Californians ended up paying more for their electricity anyway. Part of it was through their bills, eventually, but a big chunk came from their taxes. The state's budget surplus, it vanished, turned into a massive deficit. So Sowell asks, did they actually save any money in the long run with those price controls?
Yeah, were those initial savings worth all the trouble that followed?
Right, especially when you consider the added tax burden, the potential cuts to public services, because of that budget shortfall. It's very possible they paid more than if they had just let the market adjust to those higher costs from the beginning.
So the price controls just masked the problem and shifted the cost elsewhere, maybe even made it worse in the end.
Exactly. And this isn't just a California thing. So Drell points out that price controls have this long, consistent history of causing shortages all over the world, going back centuries. They've tried it with all sorts of goods and services, and the results are pretty much the same.
Not good.
No, not good. So the big lesson here is that messing with prices, trying to control them artificially, often creates unintended consequences. It throws the whole market out of whack.
Okay, so price controls, tempting as they might seem, are not the answer. Now let's switch gears a bit and talk about recycling. How does Sowell analyze recycling, especially when we consider the difference between recycling that's driven by market forces versus recycling that's driven by political pressure or social trends?
This is an interesting area where Sowell really highlights how economic efficiency can sometimes clash with, good intentions. He argues that recycling can occur naturally, spontaneously even, in a free market, when the value of those salvaged materials is higher than the cost of collecting, sorting, and processing them.
So if it makes financial sense for someone to collect and sell, say, discarded cardboard or scrap metal, they'll do it without needing the government to tell them to or some big public awareness campaign.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he uses a great example. Informal recyclers in many parts of Africa, often women and children who are doing this because it's genuinely economically efficient for them.
Makes sense.
They have limited job options, wages are low, and they can actually make a decent profit from collecting and selling recyclables, things like plastic containers. That profit, it's more than they could earn doing something else.
And it benefits everyone, right? Less waste, resources being reused.
Absolutely. From a broader societal perspective, it's a win-win. They're productively using what Sowell calls superabundant labor.
Meaning people whose time has a low opportunity cost.
Exactly. So their individual economic incentives, they line up with a positive social outcome.
It's a beautiful thing when that happens.
It is. But now, contrast that with recycling that's mainly driven by politics, environmental campaigns, or social pressure without that solid economic foundation. In those cases, the cost of the whole recycling process, the collection, the special bins, the sorting facilities, the energy used to reprocess everything, that can actually exceed the value of the materials you get back. There have been studies of government-mandated recycling programs in developed countries that show that.
So it's costing more than it's worth.
Right. And then the question is, who's paying for that extra cost?
Well, if it's not economically viable, someone has to make up the difference. So it's either taxpayers or consumers, right?
Exactly. They end up footing the bill for something that wouldn't necessarily make sense in a free market. And the political appeal of being green, promoting recycling, it can be strong.
It feels good.
It does, but it can lead to programs that, when you look at the whole picture, aren't economically sound. You have to consider all the stages, who benefits, who pays, not just that initial feel-good factor.
So Sowell's not against recycling, but he's saying that for it to be truly sustainable, it needs to be driven by genuine economic value, not just political convenience or emotional appeals.
That's a very insightful way to put it. He's all about that comprehensive cost-benefit analysis, looking at the whole system, not just a single piece of the puzzle.
It's about making sure the benefits actually outweigh the costs in the long run. Now, this brings us to a broader question. How do different economic systems handle the production and distribution of goods and services? That whole debate between central planning and market mechanisms.
That's a big one, for sure. For a lot of people, central planning has this appeal, right? It seems more organized, more rational, maybe even more fair than those often chaotic markets.
I get that.
Sowell, though, he insists on judging economic systems based on their actual outcomes, not on those utopian ideals. It's about looking at what they actually achieve, comparing that to the theories behind them, whether it's socialism or capitalism.
So it's not about what they promise, it's about what they deliver.
Exactly. He makes this interesting point. All economic systems, by their very nature, they involve restrictions. They prevent people from having as much of everything as they want because resources are limited. The key difference is how those restrictions are imposed and by whom.
So it's not about having restrictions versus not having them, it's about who gets to decide.
That's a great way to frame it. In a market economy, scarcity and individual preferences, expressed through prices, largely determine what gets produced and who gets it.
It's driven by supply and demand.
Exactly. But in a centrally planned economy, it's the government that decides.
The central authority makes those choices.
Right. Now, Sowell offers a definition of socialism. It's an economic system where the rights to own and control property in those key sectors of the economy, they are determined by political authorities, not primarily through private transactions in the market.
Okay, so the government decides who owns and controls those important parts of the economy.
Exactly. And he frames it as an empirical question. Do these arrangements actually lead to the goals that socialists talk about? Like greater equality, better job security, more efficient use of resources.
So does it actually work the way they say it will?
Right. And to answer that, he looks at real-world examples, both small-scale voluntary attempts at socialism, like the kibbutz in Israel, and those large-scale state-imposed systems, like what we saw in the Soviet Union, Maoist China, or even, to some extent, in India and France.
So by comparing these different examples, we can get a better understanding of the practical challenges and the results of these different ways of organizing an economy.
That's the idea.
The kibbutz is a fascinating case study. It was this attempt to create a communal way of life, a shared economy.
Right. What does Sowell take away from that example?
He uses this, seemingly minor incident, this teapot scandal in the kibbutz, to illustrate some fundamental challenges with communal living.
Oh, tell me about this scandal.
Well, it turned out that even in this community dedicated to sharing and equality, there was this resistance to suppressing individual preferences, like owning a private teapot and making tea in your own room. That was seen as a threat to the whole communal spirit by some people.
Wow, a teapot.
Yeah, it highlights how hard it is to completely align individual desires with those collective norms and decisions, even in a relatively small, ideologically aligned group.
Even when everyone's supposed to be on the same page, those individual differences, those preferences, they still pop up.
Exactly.
And when you try to scale that up from a small community to a whole national economy, it gets even more complicated.
Absolutely. And so Sowell points to the fact that many socialist and communist governments around the world, they ended up abandoning central planning, especially towards the end of the 20th century.
Like the Soviet Union. Right. They just weren't getting the results they hoped for. Economies were struggling, people were unhappy. So that historical shift, it tells us something about the viability of centrally planned systems.
It's a real-world data point, a pretty big one.
For sure. Now, Sowell also emphasizes the role of prices in a market economy.
Okay.
Prices, they act like signals. They direct resources to where they're most needed, and they also ration consumption by reflecting scarcity.
So if something is scarce, the price goes up, and that encourages people to use less of it.
Exactly. And he goes back to that kibbutz example, noting that when electricity and food were provided without any direct cost to individuals, consumption shot up.
When they introduced prices for those things, consumption dropped significantly.
So people started being more mindful of how much they were using.
Right, because now there was a cost associated with it.
The price reflected the scarcity of the resource.
Precisely. And it influenced their behavior.
So prices aren't just about making money. They're about conveying information and coordinating behavior. Exactly. And then Sowell contrasts that with the immense challenge faced by central planners.
Trying to manage a whole economy from the top down.
It's almost impossible.
Yeah.
They're trying to keep track of millions of constantly changing individual needs and preferences. It's overwhelming.
Versus each person just paying attention to the prices of the things they need.
Exactly. It's much more decentralized, more efficient, and he brings up a common problem in centrally planned economies, like the Soviet Union. You'd have warehouses full of stuff nobody wanted, alongside shortages of the things people actually needed.
It's a mismatch between what's being produced and what people are actually demanding.
Right, and that's because those central planners, they couldn't accurately gauge those demands. And this wasn't just the Soviet Union. Other centrally planned economies like India and China, before their market reforms, they struggled with this too.
So it seems like a recurring problem.
It is, and Sowell makes a really interesting comparison. The resource-rich but chronically poor Soviet Union versus countries like Japan and Switzerland. They don't have a lot of natural resources, but they're wealthy.
So it's not just about having resources, it's about how you manage them, the economic system you have in place.
Exactly. And then you look at China. After the Maoist era, they started moving towards a more market-based economy, and their growth has been dramatic.
The same with India. When they eased up on those government controls, they also saw significant growth.
Right. It really highlights the impact of economic systems.
You really matter.
They do. And Sowell concludes by saying that those price-coordinated economies, like capitalism, free markets, they rely on the movement of prices to allocate resources. It's all done without any central control. He tells this story about Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union, and Margaret Thatcher, the former British Prime Minister.
Oh, tell me about this.
So Gorbachev asks Thatcher how Britain ensures that its people have enough food. And her answer, it's simple but profound. Prices did that. Just 3 words, but it captures the essence of how markets work.
It's amazing how powerful that price mechanism is. Now, another critical piece of how economic systems work is incentives. How does Sowell talk about incentives? How they shape behavior and ultimately those economic results.
Sowell argues that the particular incentives built into an economic system, they have a huge impact on how individuals and organizations behave, even in simple everyday tasks. And he tells this rather shocking anecdote from the Soviet Union.
Oh, what's this?
So picture this. A conscientious worker in the Soviet Union, she's loading loaves of bread, and she notices bird droppings on some of them.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So being responsible, she takes those loaves back to the bakery. But later, she finds out that they didn't throw away the contaminated bread. They ground it up, mixed it with the flour, and used it to bake new loaves. Those loaves, now with bird droppings in them, were then sent out to stores to be sold.
That is horrifying.
It is. And Sowell contrasts that with what would most likely happen in a capitalist system, a competitive market. A company that did something like that, they'd be in huge trouble.
They would face lawsuits, health inspections, the whole 9 yards.
Absolutely.
Huh.
But even more immediate, they'd risk losing customers if word got out. Sales would plummet, their reputation would be tarnished, and they could go bankrupt.
So in a free market, there's this built-in incentive to maintain quality and accountability.
Right. You mess up, you lose customers, you lose money. But a government-owned monopoly, like they had in the Soviet Union, they didn't face that same pressure.
They had no competition, so they could get away with stuff like that.
Precisely. And Sowell extends this to environmental issues. He notes that environmental damage was often far worse in those communist bloc countries compared to capitalist nations. Like, think of Chernobyl.
That was a horrific example of what can happen when accountability and safety incentives are weak.
Exactly. So the structure of incentives within a system, it really does matter. It affects the quality of what's produced, the level of responsibility.
It shapes behavior. Now, let's move on to something we hear a lot about in both economics and politics. The concept of rights. So, specifically addresses statements like, water is a right. What's his take on that from an economic perspective?
So he's careful to separate political rhetoric from economic analysis.
Right, those are two different things.
They are. So while both politicians and economists might agree that it's good for people to have clean, safe water, Sowell argues that just declaring it a right doesn't really mean anything economically.
How so? I mean, water is essential for survival, so wouldn't you say it's a fundamental right?
It's not that the desire for water is meaningless, but saying it's a right doesn't address the practical realities. Providing clean water, it takes resources. You need infrastructure, dams, reservoirs, treatment plants, pipes to get it to everyone's homes. Just saying it's a right doesn't make those things appear magically.
It's not a solution, it's more of a statement of what we want.
Right. It expresses a desire, a moral aspiration, but it doesn't tell us how to actually achieve that. It can even obscure the real economic costs and trade-offs involved. So whenever we hear something declared a right, we should ask, okay, but how are we going to actually provide this? What are the costs and who's going to pay?
It's about thinking beyond that initial declaration and looking at the practical implications. Now, let's talk about human capital. What's Sowell's definition of that, and why does he think it's become so important in modern economies?
Sowell defines human capital as that accumulation of skills, knowledge, insights, abilities, the general competence that people acquire through schooling, on-the-job training, learning on their own, all sorts of experiences. It includes things like the values and knowledge passed down from parents and peers.
So it's not just about formal education, it's about everything you learn and experience that makes you more capable.
Exactly. And he stresses that human capital is not just some abstract idea. It has real-world consequences for how productive you are, how much you can earn.
It's a valuable asset.
It is. And he argues that its importance has been growing, especially in our modern knowledge-based economies. In the past, when physical strength was more important for work, people's earning potential usually peaked earlier in their lives.
Yeah, when your body was at its strongest.
But now it's all about specialized skills, expertise. The more you learn, the more experience you gain, the more valuable you become. And that's reflected in how earnings tend to increase over time as people build their human capital.
So it's a shift from brawn to brains, essentially.
You could say that. And Sowell also points out that this has helped close the income gap between men and women in many developed countries.
Because physical strength is less important.
Right. But at the same time, it can lead to greater inequality between those who invest in their knowledge and skills and those who don't.
So education and training become even more crucial.
They do. And he tells this great story about F.W. Woolworth, the founder of the Woolworth chain of stores.
Oh, I love those old five and dime stores.
Yeah, well, early in his career, Woolworth took an unpaid apprenticeship. Yeah, for the first 3 months, he wasn't paid anything. He worked long hours, sweeping floors, dusting shelves, that kind of thing. Now, that might sound exploitative today, but Woolworth saw it as an investment. He was learning the retail business from the ground up. He was thinking beyond those initial 3 months of no pay.
He was playing the long game.
He was. And it paid off. Big time. That experience he gained, it was essential to his later success. He even made his old employer a partner in his business later on, recognizing the value of that opportunity. But Sowell points out that many modern labor laws, like minimum wage laws, they've eliminated those kinds of opportunities. You can't really have unpaid apprenticeships anymore.
Which makes sense in a way to protect workers from being taken advantage of.
Right, but it can also have unintended consequences. It can limit those entry-level opportunities for people who don't have a lot of experience.
Especially for those just starting out.
Exactly. Now, even today, people will take lower-paying jobs if they see it as a chance to gain valuable experience in a particular field. They're thinking beyond that initial low salary.
They're investing in their future earning potential.
Exactly. And so Jim will talks about the potential downsides of policies that reduce those opportunities for low-skilled or inexperienced workers.
Like significantly increasing the minimum wage.
Right. He says those often dismissed menial jobs, they can be stepping stones, a way for people to develop work habits, learn basic skills, build resume. And those who just focus on the immediate loss of those jobs, they're missing the bigger picture.
They're not considering the long-term impact on those who need those jobs the most.
Precisely. It's like pulling out the bottom rungs of the ladder. He also addresses those who criticize low wages in developing countries, those jobs created by multinational corporations.
Yeah, there's often outrage about those sweatshops.
But Sowell points out that the productivity of those workers is often low too, because of factors like limited education or infrastructure. And those jobs, they often pay more than the local alternatives, and they can provide valuable training.
So even if the wages seem low by Western standards, they can still be a step up for those workers.
Exactly. It's all about context. And he reminds us that most multinational corporations, they operate in high-wage countries, not just chasing the cheapest labor.
Because higher productivity often makes up for those higher wages.
Right. It's a more complex picture than just saying corporations are always looking to exploit workers. Now, shifting gears a bit, Sowell gives some examples of how government regulations, even well-intentioned ones, can backfire. He talks about job security laws.
Okay.
Like in Germany, they have high labor costs, partly due to strict job protection laws and mandatory benefits.
So it's hard to fire people.
Right. And while that provides security for those who have jobs, it can make businesses reluctant to hire new people.
Because it's too expensive and risky.
Exactly. So you end up with this trade-off. Security for some, but fewer opportunities for others.
Makes sense.
And then there's India. They had these really rigid job security laws in state-owned enterprises, which led to low productivity because it was practically impossible to fire anyone, even if they weren't doing their job.
It's hard to get people to work hard if there are no consequences for not doing so.
Right. And those kinds of laws, while aimed at protecting workers, they can stifle innovation and economic growth.
It creates a disincentive for both individual and organizational improvement.
Absolutely. And Sowell even talks about the tenure system in American universities.
Oh yeah, publish or perish.
Right. It's supposed to ensure quality, but it can sometimes lead to really good teachers being let go because they focus more on teaching than on research, which is often more heavily weighted for tenure.
So a system designed to promote quality can end up pushing out talented people.
It's an unintended consequence, and it highlights how important it is to think through the full range of effects of any policy or regulation, not just focus on one narrow goal.
It's about understanding those complex interconnections. Now, before we wrap up, Sowell makes this really intriguing point about how the logic of incentives, it can even apply to areas we don't usually think of in economic terms, like crime.
Yeah, it's fascinating. He argues that even decisions related to criminal behavior, they can be analyzed through the lens of costs and benefits.
So criminals are still making rational choices in a way.
Right, like he mentioned studies that show that burglary rates tend to be lower in areas where more people legally own guns.
Makes sense. If you're a burglar, you're less likely to target a house where you might get shot.
Exactly. So even in those illegal activities, people are still responding to incentives, weighing the risks and rewards. It's
Mhm.
a reminder that these basic principles of economics, they have a pretty wide reach.
They're applicable to all sorts of human behavior.
They are.
Well, as we conclude this deep dive into Thomas Sowell's applied economics, I think the key takeaway is that question, and then what? By looking beyond those initial effects, those politically appealing promises, we can get a much clearer picture of the true long-term consequences of our choices.
I go,
Whether it's understanding the hidden costs of free stuff, or analyzing the ripple effects of price controls, or recognizing those trade-offs that come with even the best-intentioned regulations, thinking beyond stage one is crucial.
it helps us make better decisions, both for ourselves and for society.
Exactly. So, the learner, we hope this is giving you some food for thought, some new tools to analyze the world around you. Now, here's a challenge for you. Think of a policy debate that's happening right now, maybe something you've seen in the news.
It's a girl.